So remember how I said in the last part of this that this one wouldn't be nearly as long as the first part? Yeah, I sort of didn't realize that this part is 2.5 hours long. What's going on, you guys? It's your Bat Hell 24 here, and yes, we are finally back with part 2 of the Device Theory by Molly Stars. This is probably going to be the longest reaction video on my channel. Not the longest video ever on my channel, because the previous video was every single part of my Salvation OG replay in one video, which is over 7.5 hours long, so yeah, but this will be the single longest reaction video on my channel, and it'll also be the longest one with a single video in it, because this one video is 2 hours 32 minutes long, and this intro is already made this video already longer than the previous part. So without any further ado,
This is a three-part analysis I'm doing on Deltarune's potential meta-narrative and examining the secrets in the game, parts of its internal data, and even stuff like the user interface to see what picture it paints for Deltarune's myth.
So, if you didn't watch part 1 of this device theory, basically Molly Stars laid the groundwork for this theory, and also went over Undertale as a way to sort of highlight how Toby Fox tackle storytelling and how Toby Fox tackles game design and stuff like that. Then we got into Chapter 1, the 2018 release of Chapter 1, which was Server Program, and we went over all the meta stuff in Chapter 1, the stuff outside of the game, like the sprite names, the object names, the music names, everything about it that is meta. This part, I feel like it's gonna be a lot of Chapter 2 and Spampton Sweepstakes, because apparently this part delves deep into the Spampton Sweepstakes stuff. So I'm very interested in seeing what Molly Stars has to say about the Spampton Sweepstakes. Yeah.
Message on a meta level. This part will be discussing the 2021 demo and the Spampton Sweepstakes, and we'll be pretty much continuing right from where part 1 left off. If you'd like to watch part 1 first, though, there will be a card linking you to that video, and some links in the description.
I've already watched part 1, let's go to part 2.
Obviously, this will be spoiling Deltarune and perhaps some parts of Undertale as well, so I'd recommend you play those games if you haven't already.
I have.
By the way, whether or not you watch part 1 or play these games, get comfy, and I hope you enjoy even more rambling of the funny video game.
And also, I really hope that this recording does not die halfway through. Hopefully this is in one video, but if it's not, then you'll see 2 separate parts or maybe more pop up in your feed here. I really hope that this is all in one video though, because I do not want to post multiple parts of a reaction if I don't have to. So
enjoy.
This baseball does not work. Anyway, let's hop back on.
Good morning. It's September 17th, 2021.
And if you can believe it, it's a Friday once again. Yup. Chapter 2's release was like, holy shit, what the fuck is going on? Ah! Because I was watching the the anniversary stream where Toby and his dads played Deltarune Chapter 1, and I wasn't really expecting anything all that much. Then I saw the ending where it said continue to Chapter 2, and I was laying in bed. When I saw that, I was like, oh my god! Like, I literally convulsed. Not really, but I was internally convulsing and freaking the fuck out. Because, yeah, Chapter 2. Yup. Yeah. Yeah, it was crazy. The hidden route, I remember being live playing chapter 2 when someone in my chat came in, told me that there was a hidden route. I was like, okay, after I'm done with the game, tell me how to do this hidden route. And I did! I did do Snowgrave. I just had not uploaded the final part of Snowgrave, which didn't really take long because it was just me beating Spent Neo. But I will do it when I stream these games again when Chapters 3 to 5 come out. I will be doing a marathon where I will stream every day until I complete the, like, sort of pacifist route of all 5 chapters. And then maybe I'll do a full Snowgrave of all 5 chapters. Deal? Deal. Deal. Oh, yeah, Chapter 3 demo. The demo! Yes.
2 days prior, a live stream was held in celebration of Undertale's 6th anniversary.
And I remember watching this. I remember watching this live. I tuned into this. I think about halfway through. But it was still insanely fun. This was a very, very good live. It was a very good live. Not just because we got the Chapter 2 release date, but because, my god, Toby gave us a lot of insight about how he made Chapter 1, what went into creating Chapter 1. Also, there were a bunch of bits in the stream that I thought were, you know, amazing. The 3D tutorial, what the fuck? Hello? Fucking, what? The plushies? Oh! So cute, adorable, the absolutely most adorable plushies ever in the world. Oh. But yeah, and then it also came to the Chapter 2 release date, which was revealed to only be a few days after this live, which... yeah.
Anniversary, in which Toby and the 3 dads played through a slightly modified version of Deltarune Chapter 1 for some reason. Toby gave some pretty interesting insight.
Also, yeah, this was a modified version of Chapter 1. It was definitely modified. Certain things were changed, and I believe Toby did that intentionally, because he would have to go out of his way to change the code of the game to make these things work. One of them is Newbert. My man! You know? That guy was apparently in Chapter 1 all this time, we just never fucking knew.
Light into the creative process for Chapter 1, as well as this main tidbit here about the Suzy versus Lancer fight.
Okay.
So if you notice, the hearts come from the top right.
That's Chris.
Yeah, that's where Chris is.
Yeah! I was gonna say that's where they are.
It's not a bug.
But it was at the end of the live stream that the fandom collectively lost their shit, including myself, as it was revealed to all be a build-up for the release of...
I did, because I saw this moment and I was like, shut the fuck up, shut the fuck up, hang on, hold on, hold on, hold on, Chapter 2, Chapter 2's real, Chapter 2, oh my god! And I was, you know,
Deltarune Chapter
freaking
2,
the fuck out.
which we got a glimpse of at the very end of the broadcast, and a release of September 17th at 8 PM Eastern Standard Time. And on that day, and time, just before it released proper, a certain someone would return with some new words with us. I couldn't get any actual archives on the Wayback Machine of the Twitter account when Gaster took over again for Chapter 2, at least that I know of, so you just have to believe me when I say that it was the same deal as Chapter 1
it was.
over, with the account going dark.
It actually was. Molly's not lying here. It actually... The account actually did go dark the same way that it did with Chapter 1. And who we presume is Gaster, came on and told us all about how he's been waiting for us. Like the good little mystery man that he is. Oh my god, he's been waiting for all of us this entire time. He cares about us. Oh my god. No, he doesn't. Because if he cared about us, if Gaster cared about us, he'd fucking show up in the game. Wouldn't you, Mystery Man? Mr. G. Mr. Wing Ding. Stop winging it.
Dad, we're leaving in a few minutes.
And by it, I mean your ding!
Yet again, the name just being 6 boxes. He remarks on how long it's been since Chapter 1's release, and commends everyone for sticking around through these difficult times.
Difficult times?
Perhaps even Gaster has been going through it in the absolute travesty that the past few years have ended up.
Yeah, difficult times. This was happening in 2012. Oh, we know about difficult times, bucko. We know about... the lockdown. God, that was 4 years ago when the entire world shut down. Crazy. It's crazy to think about.
He then says that Deltarune glows brightly from our hope before sending the link to the website once again to the second field.
Yes!
The second connection.
The second connection.
And there, the demo for Deltarune that we know of releases on Steam and itch.io, which includes the first 2 chapters of the game, and now we can begin talking about this more recent demo properly.
Yeah, it includes both Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, and I believe Chapter 1 was changed a little bit. I don't know if a lot was changed in Chapter 1 when it was released in the 1 or 2 demo package, but I do know that was a kind of a big thing, because it had both Chapters 1 and 2. We're still waiting for Chapter 3 to 5. Toby, please God, give us Chapter 3 right now. We are all going fucking crazy looking at just the minuscule details ever in the game. Ow. It kinda hurt.
Hopefully this won't be as lengthy to explain as with Survey Program, as at this point I'll just
Spoiler, it
section
was.
from the previous demo, and of course any trends I notice in Chapter 2 and how things have developed from Chapter 1 meta-wise. However,
Yeah?
before I truly get into Part 2 properly, I want to dedicate a chunk of this video to making sure that it is not out of date in context with Part 1's release, considering that this audio and script were originally made before I became a niche Deltarune celebrity, and the video being made after the fact. Although I am
Oh my god, that old ass.
Most of my sappy words and thank yous for the end of the series, while I'm very happy with how Part 1 has been received, and very happy with how well it appears I have managed to resonate with a good portion of the fan base, I want to take a few solid minutes to patch up some holes in Part 1 and critique myself a little bit, as especially after responding to many comments from Part 1, there are things that I have either gotten outright wrong, things that I have somehow managed to not include, or things that I just think would be neat to mention otherwise in the grander scheme of this series.
I'll probably need to get out at some point during this reaction, so if you hear movement, that's me standing up.
Of corrections and revisions for those who have watched Part 1, and for the sake of keeping my info as accurate as possible.
Wait, what?
One, and for the sake of lightning round but not really, of corrections and revisions for those who have watched Part 1, and for the sake of keeping my info as accurate as possible.
Okay, let's watch these corrections.
I feel is most important to mention. In Part 1 of the device theory, I called attention to a few lines of code in the game's data that I thought implied that if the player's name in the light world was 7 or more characters long, that the name would change the question marks, implying that we would at some point play as another character in the light world altogether. Consider this point completely and objectively wrong. Shortly after Part 1's release, I was pinged on Andrew Cunningham's Discord server by Brix, who you might know for his video on the Submarine Castletown theory. If you don't, check it out, it's cool. But I quickly got clarification that this is actually leftover data from Undertale's UI code. So in Undertale, your name can only be 6 characters long at the most. The game even makes a joke about this when you try to enter the name Papyrus, as you aren't able to enter the last letter of his name. But if you manage to hack your name to be longer than that through file editing, text would display in the stats menu that would say
Easy to change, huh?
For reference, this is where the Since Chapter 1 text would display in Deltarune. And this is where the question marks actually display. It is just pasted over from Undertale's code, except instead of easy to change, it's these 3 question marks.
Interesting.
Nothing actually happens to the player name. While I do still find it odd that this text was changed in Deltarune to begin with, I will say that at this point, I would not put too much stock into this information to begin with anymore. It might be important later down the line, but chances are it doesn't really mean anything, and there's something
it could be useful in, like, later chapters. We don't know anything about chapters 3 and beyond, so at some point this may actually be useful, you know? Unless, why would it affect the player then? Maybe Maybe that would change the question marks for a different character? I don't know. Depending on if we do play a different character in later chapters. Which, knowing Toby, we probably will, but, I mean, that's a very, very, like, that's a very big stretch to make that we'll probably play as someone else other than Chris in a later chapter. But is it likely? Unlikely, but possible.
Really easily make of it right now, especially compared to pretty much everything that I'm about to touch on in this point.
Okay.
And while not about this piece of code anymore, I do want to mention something else about the UI real quick that I think is worth clarifying, which is that technically in Undertale your attack and defense stats do actually also start at 10.
Okay.
But for some reason in Undertale it's subtracted so that it displays as 0, but as a base it does start at 10.
Mm-hmm.
I've also seen the explanation that perhaps Chris's stats are different simply because they're older than Frisk, which I guess that checks out, but
Skill
who
issue,
knows
maybe?
really, but it does make sense to me honestly.
Alright.
2. This is less of a correction, but more of a critique of my own theorizing process in regards to Gaster that I'd like to touch on, but there are things I feel I should have included in part 1 regarding him that ultimately slipped my radar.
Okay.
One thing that I'm kind of shocked I never mentioned about Gaster as a potential calling card or part of his mannerisms is his constant allusions and connections to hands. The man who speaks in hands, the website in 2018 saying, "Take it in your hands," with that last word having a noticeable line break, and that phrase coming up more than once, the potential allusion to hands through wingdings as a font.
That's
Even
Gaster.
Susie mentioning hands after the spammed neophyte, although that is chapter 2 material, so it's no wonder I never really mentioned it in part 1.
Yeah,
While
I was gonna
suppose
say.
it doesn't tell me too much about Gaster.
I was gonna say, anything that is in part 2, you did not touch on in part 1, because you didn't go over chapter 2 in part 1, because it wasn't out yet at the time. But now it is. So we have a long, long section to get through.
Still, it does still feel worth mentioning and could be a decent way of identifying his relevance in any given situation. Aside from that, the critique about my theorizing process comes in what I would deem to be actually Gaster, as in what actually is worth putting stock into associating with him. In part 1, I was incredibly picky in this regard. I only wanted to stick to things that would directly acknowledge him, undoubtedly, without having to make more than a few connections back to him, even going as far as to differentiate things like the use of man and him, or not associating the mystery man or the man behind the tree with Gaster outright. While I do still believe this meticulousness was warranted to an extent thanks to the countless fandom Mandela effects that have spawned surrounding him, I'd like to be a little bit more lenient from here on in that regard. I don't want to undermine the fact that there is plenty of reason to believe that the mystery man at least is Gaster, and that the man behind the tree undoubtedly could be tied to him in some way or what have you. And in retrospect, I think being so meticulous at undermining the allusions to him through the word man, as it might be someone other than him, seems a little bit silly on my part. Saying that it's someone other than him, and saying that it is him, the Venn diagram in that case would be just a fucking circle practically. In both cases, it is a character we know very little about, and someone who we likely will learn more about over the course of Deltarin's narrative. While I still don't want to assume without any doubt that Gaster straight up is the mystery man, or the man behind the tree, or even the strange someone who spoke to Jevil, or the person who was talking to Spamden over the phone, some of these leads were clearly placed with intent, with us to be able to connect it back to him eventually, and that was the point that I was trying to get across in part 1 at least. You might not know to what extent, and how many proxies there may.
In other words, arguing over whether something was Gaster's or someone else's doing seems like a fruitless effort. But the connections that exist, we don't know by how much. That is true. There are connections to Gaster that exist, but we all just don't know by how much. Yeah.
Maybe before I get to the man himself in some cases, but with us only having 2 chapters...
And plus, we don't know if we're actually gonna see Gaster in chapter 3 or later on.
Personally, I think there is a way to...
I hope so, but...
cases like the mystery man especially can both be Gaster and not be Gaster, and have those interpretations coexist.
Can be both Gaster and not actually Gaster.
But my point is, with Gaster especially, I think I started teetering on the edge a bit of the other extreme of the theorizing spectrum, where you start to worry too much about the minor details and things that don't connect yet. Even though you already have the general idea and the intent that was meant to be sent across, and in this case, I think that general idea is pretty clear to me when you look at all of these things in conjunction. That being, regardless of how you think it manifests, or in what way, all of these things do in fact connect back to him. He might not always be directly involved, or maybe these instances of him aren't final, but I believe that he does not always have to be. What matters is that he is present, and for now I believe that can be good enough for us to work with, considering we only have 2 chapters to work with still.
True.
3. I mentioned in part 1 that I had a lot of issues really connecting Another Hymn or man.ogg to Gaster's theme properly.
Yeah.
In all of my digging and examining of each of these songs, I personally came to the conclusion that Gaster's theme ultimately isn't really a good calling card at all for Gaster, as his leitmotif doesn't really seem to actually appear in Another Hymn or man.ogg.
True.
While I think this still seems to be the case, what did slip my radar was that the intervals between the notes are still very similar, which is a fair point. While they don't outright copy Gaster's theme, I think this is a case where I can safely still assume that Another Hymn especially is related to him, because while it's not using the same motif, it's clearly still made with the same intent.
Yeah.
Different songs, but made with the same idea. Perhaps Gaster's theme could be taken as a sort of precursor or demo of Another Hymn even. Smile.ogg, however, I realize can be put in the opposite situation, where it actually might not be fully reliable as a calling card for Gaster, but rather Dark Worlds in general. Although personally, I feel like this still could fall into a similar theory pitfall that I mentioned in—
Now, are we gonna hear Smile.ogg again? Like, apart from Chris's phone and the droning at the bunker? I wonder if we're gonna hear that anywhere else.
The last correction. Or even if it might not directly involve him in all cases, it certainly still ties back to him, and Dark Worlds in general can tie back to him in several ways. Especially if my take on all of this in part 3 turns out to be ringing true after all, then really separating Smile.ogg's relevance to Gaster from its relevance to Dark Worlds might not be all that necessary at the end of the day. But as always, we'll just have to wait and see. Oh yeah, and I cannot believe that I never mentioned this, but man.ogg is ripped straight from a collection of fan tracks to me that were inspired by Yume Nikki. Man.ogg here being named as Waltz of Sakam Masada.
Yes.
Sakam Masada, to be specific, is a monochrome character who appears in the spaceship in Yume Nikki. Given Gaster's obvious inspirations from Yume Nikki and Oboa and what have you, this could be potential hints towards him being more involved with the egg shenanigans and the men behind the tree, but regardless, I'm kind of baffled that this slipped by me, honestly.
Okay.
Also throwing this in very last minute, but I feel implored to call your attention to Andrew Cunningham's recent video on Gaster's theme and its potential presence in the Deltarune OST, as it's
I've seen that.
informed and in-depth look at the whole thing, and one that I think was very much needed for the community.
I feel like we've all seen that Andrew Cunningham video by now. It's a good video. It is a good video. It's a really, really good video.
Even with my knowledge in making music, I wouldn't call myself an expert at analyzing it or the theory behind it, and Andrew does very well in that regard with what is effectively the closest we have at the moment to an actual encyclopedia of sorts on quotes of his theme and the varying strength of said quotes. So do check it out if you want a more in-depth look at how songs like Another Hymn, man.ogg, and a bunch of other ones seem to have hints of it laced within. It's a very good watch, and one that I think has clarified a lot of the confusion I felt initially about the theme altogether. Also, just look at this fucking doohickey that he built up in, like, Godot or whatever. How could you not appreciate the fucking mechanism? It's cool. Give it a look if you haven't already. But moving on. 4. About Gallery. I'm still kind of stumped on what to make of it really, but I have gotten plenty of comments from part 1 about an actually pretty plausible possibility for what the title could be referring to.
Okay.
The concept of a rogue's gallery. For those unfamiliar, rogue's gallery refers to, generally, a collection of nefarious individuals.
Okay.
This can be referred to in real life as a collection of mugshots of criminal suspects, or more likely, in fictional media, refers to a lineup of recurring antagonists that show up throughout a story, which does check out very closely to what we're currently dealing with in Deltarune's structure and how it has handled antagonists so far.
True.
We'll have to see more of the game ultimately to really be sure, but honestly this does seem like the most likely interpretation for what the
If we hear Gallery in the Chapter 3 boss, then that would kind of hammer home the idea of, yeah, it's for, you know, enemies that are recurring in the story. So
title Gallery could be alluding to, and I wouldn't put it past Toby at all for him to make some kind of nod to this concept, given it has played in both chapters to preface a boss fight with the main recurring antagonist.
yeah.
5. While Spamton, Jevil, Sham, and Rouse are still my main 4 characters that I think are particularly important for Deltarune's meta-narrative, they aren't the only Darkners to happen to have some more meta-knowledge.
Okay.
In fact, Darkners in general seem to be actually decently aware of the nature of their world, or at least the mechanics of
the
battle
jigsaws
system and some elements of said battle system. Although, I've gotten a lot of comments about Lancer in particular, as he's another character who actually straight up mentions player controls in this sign here that you can read in the field in Chapter 1, and him alluding to the legend cutscene and showing up in it if he happened to ignore Rousey's request to listen to him upon first arriving in Castletown. He definitely does show some signs of being more aware than some other Darkners, but it does seem like he and other characters don't really call too much attention to this, and Lancer himself doesn't seem very bothered at all about this awareness himself. Unlike a certain someone who I'll talk about later in this.
Ralsei.
6. the glass shard that you can get in the light world upon obtaining a shadow crystal in the dark world has one thing that I forgot to really specify.
Yeah.
We don't really know if it actually is a glass shard fully. See, we know that the shadow crystal is described as only being visible thanks to its sharp shadow, and in the light world it's possible that it doesn't actually change in appearance between worlds, but rather that the light world could be misidentifying it as a shard of glass because it doesn't know what else to refer to it as. In the light world, it just describes it as a shard of something that feels like glass, but before it trails off. There is the possibility that it is just glass, but at the same time, I think the potential for the light world's UI and for the light world in general to pretty much be finding ways to get around the
Sorry, I'm being quiet. I'm just kind of taking in the corrections
that would otherwise
before we get to the actual good bits.
In the light world is a very fascinating prospect to me, especially in the context of the meta-narrative. It's also especially worth noting, as I do think that the shadow crystals will culminate into something that could prove incredibly important for said meta-narrative later down the line, and possibly even for Gaster himself.
Alright.
And finally, 7. I mentioned that the Switch port of Undertale was the second one to come out. Technically, while it is the second unique console port in terms of having different contents from the PC one, it is actually the third port. As the first and second ports were for the
PS4 and the PS
Vita, the latter of which completely slipped my radar, although as far as I know the PS4 and Vita ports are identical in their contents.
So now we can get to the good shit.
That is it for the corrections. Although, there is still one more thing I'd like to talk about in Chapter 1 before diving into the 2021 demo properly that wasn't mentioned in the comments, but I do think is worth mentioning regardless, and it relates to the thing I mentioned Toby acknowledging in the 6th anniversary.
Oh yeah, the part
in regards to the fight between Susie and Lancer. I'm going to touch on this later, but in both chapters of the game so far, there's a moment where Rousey can shift the player's perspective to Susie's point of view, so to speak, so that Rousey can talk to Chris off-screen. In Chapter 1's instance of this, though, we get a fight that is triggered by Susie after being betrayed by Lancer. The thing about this fight, though, which I found especially odd since Toby pointed it out, is that whenever your soul pops up to dodge Lancer's attacks, the soul comes from off-screen.
Yeah, it does.
Specifically from the general direction that Chris and Rousey's cell would be. I think I just didn't touch on this initially, because while I did find it odd, I had honestly no idea what to make of it. In fact, given I am adding this in after already having finished the general script, I still really don't. But this was another instance where perhaps a better look at the UI might help me a bit here for this fight and for the Dark World's battle system in general. Let's first start with the way the game changes when you start a normal battle. The background changes to this sort of grid-like pattern that shifts along the screen. And when you have to dodge attacks, I want you to pay attention to one little detail.
Yeah?
You see it? Let me zoom in a little.
Huh. Yeah, wait!
Even though the soul is only pulled out for the purpose of dodging attacks, the...
Yeah, wait! That same effect happens... Huh...
The graphic that's used to indicate its ejection is the same one that's used when Chris pulls it out themselves.
Yes.
By itself, this is a really small detail and doesn't mean much. But we know that, barring Chris's restrictions on it when they pull it out in the light world, we are able to move the soul ourselves when it's not controlling anyone. Which then brings me to another UI element. This box.
Oh?
No, not that one. Not yet. This one.
Ooh.
I do have to admit that honestly, I don't have much to go off of with this, but if I can take any shot in the dark right now, I'd like to think that, at least thanks to the fact the box is outlined in green, which kind of reminds me of the way the Chapter 1 pre-completion save menu looks, and I think with the way the background for battles normally looks, save for most boss fights, it does make me now wonder if perhaps more attention should be called to the way the battle system is presented, and if perhaps there's some piece of meta stuff to look for here. Considering that this animation of the soul's ejection is used both for Chris pulling the soul out themselves and for whenever the soul's put into this box, the only conclusion I can make right away is that in both of these cases the soul does genuinely get pulled out of Chris. In the former, it's of their own volition, but in the latter, it's done so in a way that's almost automatic, as in it's still taken out of Chris, but not in a way that puts them in that exhausted state that we see them in when they pull it out in the light world. Perhaps because all the UI elements that the soul gets pulled into work on a completely different layer meta-wise compared to the dark or light worlds themselves. Upon further reflection, this isn't really that far off from how Undertale handled its battle UI, with Centaur and Mega Flowey especially being examples of fucking with it, but I think in both cases, it reflects a similar sort of intention, in that more especially for Deltarune, because we know that Darkners are more aware of the battle system and its mechanics in general, the soul being in this green box further implying that the UI is diegetic to the game in some way could be not necessarily that the UI is a tangible thing to the characters, but is a way of sort of conveying their capabilities through bullet hell visuals.
I know saying the bullets are representatives standard for what they're actually capable of sounds really no shit in retrospect, but I'm putting emphasis on the fact that the game uses the UI to communicate this to the player, and there's potential for that to be flipped on to later down the line. Yeah, that is true. This idea could be, like, played with in later chapters, and I'm very interested to see how Toby uses some of these UI elements as a way of conveying story through diegetic features. Cool.
In essence, I'm not saying that this has to be taken literally, but that the soul has to be ejected as a means of getting the player more involved and further connecting the bridge between the reality, our inputs, and what happens in the game itself through the program that we are experiencing Deltarune through. Regardless, though, it does tell me that the soul is taken out of Chris either way, even if very temporarily, and for battles it seems to be sort of pre-programmed, or rather more necessary, where the control over whether a battle can trigger or not is not solely dependent on the player. We see, at least with Susie, that she triggers the battle herself against our will, and I do find that to be pretty important. Since that tells me, aside from her having a lot of her own will to be able to override the player's choices, the battle system is also not something that we have full control of. In a way, you can see this as early as in Chapter 1 when you had to initially warn enemies about Susie so that they won't get hurt by her. But even the act of dodging attacks from a meta standpoint happens in a way that's more automatic. Remembering what Rouse said about how the soul contains our will and compassion, and most importantly the fate of the world, perhaps there's some connection to make there. The soul has to be along for the ride since that's how enemies attack you, and considering that the condition to getting a game over is for everyone in the party to lose their HP and not just Chris, and knowing that other Darkners seem to have a good baseline grasp of how the battle system works, this feels like an instance where it makes sense to me why Gaster, or the Fun Gang in general, would need the player's input. If the enemy's attacks are in some way attacking the fate of the world, you need something that will help control that fate and keep it out of harm's way. Furthermore, on this topic of the fate of the world being attacked, you can actually die in the Susie versus Lancer fight. Or at least, if Susie somehow happens to go down, even though Chris and Rouse, while not present, are still up, Susie is the only character that appears in this segment and who participates in this fight on the player's end, and hence, her going down counts as a game over. What this further reinforces to me is that game overs don't necessarily depend on whether Chris in particular survives, but whether you preserve the HP of every character involved in a battle until it has concluded, and so that the game can continue on its
That's
intended
interesting.
course. Perhaps this is why Toby might have placed emphasis on the fact that Chris's soul came from specifically where their cell would be, even though they're not directly involved. It could be to further drive home the fact that even if Chris is not directly involved in a battle, and even if Chris's soul comes from their body regardless of if they're one initiating any battles, it doesn't change that this battle has been triggered and you need to do your part. It does not matter where you are when it happens. My point here is that I think looking at the battle system solely through the lens of HP, or getting a game over through the lens of everyone is dead, might not necessarily be the move, but rather looking at the battle system as simply another means to which the game has given you the task of making sure the story continues as it should. There is a prophecy to fulfill after all. So, perhaps the more meta way to look at the soul and content
I'm sorry I'm not
of
talking that
battles
much, I'm
is
just
that
kind of...
they're not battles. They're simply just story beats that the game needs you to pass through.
Okay.
And if everyone goes down, then that outcome simply isn't possible, therefore you have failed to progress the story, and therefore game over.
So the battles, in a way, are not just fights that increase your stats, they're actually story beats that require you to beat them in order to progress the story. That is... Huh. That's actually kind of interesting.
And if you want, you can just give up and leave it at that, but regardless, that story beat will still be there blocking you until you pass through it. That metaphorical tap in this case will be waiting until you run it. These are not simply fights. This is what must happen.
Oh. Hold on. Hold on. I see a QR code, I have to scan it. What is this? It's TV. It goes to mollystars.neocities.org/CRT. Huh. This is it. Is there a... Is this like... Morse code or something? I don't know. The title is... A.
I'll touch on this when I get to my theory proper, but I guess my point is, I have no idea why there's such a focus placed on this soul appearing from where Chris would be.
Is this an ARG with an adult
given the way the battle system is presented and how certain bosses tend to manipulate that presentation, especially spammed in Neo.
How long is this audio? This audio is... only... How long? How long is this audio? It's 12 seconds long. Morse code audio decoder. I feel like this is... Morse code. That does not look right, but I assume that... Huh.
With how that specific fight is when we see the soul turn yellow, very convenient tutorial included, I do think it actually plays rather strongly into my theory, so I'll leave it at that for now. But I'd keep it in mind. With that out of the way though, and to actually finally talk about the game, I'll start with what happens when you open this demo, because it's something that still takes me aback even now. To quickly remind you, whenever you completed survey program on subsequent openings of the demo, the game would open with the legend cutscene that you get when you let Rouse tell you about the prophecy before showing the logo and then sending you to the save menu. In this demo, assuming you've already completed Chapter 1, the game just immediately gives you a prompt asking if you want to continue to Chapter 2. And if you don't do that, or if you haven't played Chapter 1 at all, you will be met with the game's Chapter Select menu. Save for a prompt asking if you want to start with Chapter 1 already, with the ambience being that droning yet again from the game over screen in the beginning of Chapter 1. As it stands, we know that there are at least 7 chapters judging from this screen, and the code does suggest that it is accounting for only 7, although there is placeholder code for a Chapter 0 that I've noticed, but... let's just say that that's what it is, right? Just placeholder, right? I don't know what I'll do if Toby actually makes Chapter 0 a real part of the game.
I mean, there are placeholders for not only Chapter 0, but Chapters 8, 9, and 10 hidden in the game code. I don't know what he plans to do with those, but I hope that they're just placeholders and not actually... He's not actually thinking about making a Chapter 0 to this game. Because if he makes a Chapter 0, then oh my god, what is that going to be? Because Chapter 0 would have to be a prequel to Chapter 1. So... I don't know what would happen if he made a Chapter 0. I might cry. I might just cry if that happens.
I've always found this menu interesting ever since the demo launched, mainly because this is always the first thing that you are met with when you launch the game. Not that intro cutscene of the... Minus
the fact that if you've already played Chapter 1, it pops out. That thing was like, Chapter 1's completed. Do you want to play Chapter 2? Then you can just choose Chapter Select and it brings you here. But, for all intents and purposes, let's say that this is the first thing that you see when you open the game. Okay. Let's just say that you completed Chapter 1, but you go to the Chapter Select. This is what you see.
Legend, just this. You only get that cutscene when you enter a chapter.
There's also 2 small cutscenes you can get, one upon playing Chapter 2 for the first time, and one Chapter 2 pre-completion afterwards.
That you have completed. And hopefully this is my last minute audio that I need to do for this part, but this came completely out of nowhere and I have to mention it.
Okay.
Essentially, I was implying earlier that thanks to how the game only showed the cutscene upon entering a completed chapter, but the game otherwise launched at the chapter select screen, part of my theory assumes that perhaps the chapter select menu is meant to function as a sort of launcher for Deltarune. Kind of like its own OS in a way, where each chapter...
As I put it in part 3, the chapters like being basically like a version of Steam, but specifically for chapters of Deltarune. Each chapter being its own game potential. That's an interesting take on it, that the chapter select is actually a launcher. Like a sort of quote-unquote Steam launcher for each individual game. And of course, by each individual game, I'm talking about how Molly is referring to the fact that each chapter could be its own game. So its own little game. So basically the chapter select screen is a launcher for 7 individual games, you know?
Chapter is its own game that you can launch, and that may even open the possibility for future chapters to look, function, and even be completely different from the Deltarune that we know now. Keep in mind, I made this assumption since like October or November of 2022, and the code of the game already sort of suggested this because while there's files for every sprite and such in the game, there's a whole separate group of files that are a bunch of duplicates but named specifically with Chapter 1 at the end, implying that depending on what chapter you play, it would load from a specific group of files. However, rather recently it's come out that Toby has been working with some people developing GameMaker on an upcoming feature for the engine that allows for a launcher app to be utilized for the purpose of launching multiple games from a specific selection, and Toby is working with them to incorporate this system into Deltarune and its chapter select system. So, I guess I'm kind of right on this? What the fuck? Now, we don't really know the implications of this. It could just be for optimization's sake or what have you, but there is still potential for this to be used in more unconventional ways, and the fact that Toby's working on a more official, proper system for it is really making me wonder just what the hell is in store for the future if each chapter is basically being treated like its own game. As far as I know, that's not usually how it really goes with coding for different chapters. I imagine it's more so like they're all contained within the bigger bubble or concept that is the game you're making.
The main reason I can see this for this being done is either for potential ease of metafuckery or for quality of life. But regardless, this is kind of a stop and swap, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of the thing that you'd only really see for like disc swapping or stop and swap, where literally you would play a game, like say, example, Final Fantasy game, play through disc 1, but then you would have to swap out the disc 1 for disc 2 to continue the story. That's kind of the thing that you're doing with these chapters, in a way. You're literally backing out of a chapter to select a new chapter. Huh. Interesting.
The fact that Deltarune is deliberately self-containing every chapter within its own bubble is incredibly fascinating to me. Again, very last minute, but I just knew I had to mention this in part 2 as soon as I learned about it. It could very well strengthen my theory even more than I think it already has been over the months.
Yeah.
Moving on, let's actually take a look at what Chapter 2 might have to offer us in regards to Deltarune's meta-narrative.
Here we go.
The save menu for Chapter 2 pre-completion is different as it doesn't have the same ominous ambience anymore of Chapter 1's pre-completion menu. Instead having the same narrator as the post-completion menu, a background of the Great Door, and playing Faint Glow. You can carry over your save files from Chapter 1, or more specifically, the game's completion files, which you created upon completing a chapter in the respective slot.
Yes.
But the interesting thing is that you don't need to do this at all. You could just start a completely new save file without having played Chapter 1 whatsoever, and this is the only instance of Gaster actually showing up in the save menu in the form of the name selection. From what I can gather, this functions the same way as it did in the Goner Maker's save for the lack of creating or naming a vessel. However, I do want to mention something interesting about the vessel, specifically if you play Chapter 2 on a save file without transferring from Chapter 1. Normally, if you go into the configuration file, or basically just the code for your save file, you'll notice that the first line contains your player or creator name, but the second line contains the name that you gave your vessel.
Yes.
This is already pretty intriguing to me, as the fact that it's one of the first things that the save file records and that it's still stored.
Yeah, people are kind of intrigued on the whole thing where, like I say, it's not only the player name, but also the vessel name. And I know that some people are thinking that maybe this will come back in later chapters and we'll actually see our physical vessel in the game as an NPC. I'm very interested for that.
It does tell me that it could have some importance or use still, albeit it might just be because the variable had to be set to that given the opportunity, and you can't truly discard or unset a variable, if you get what I mean. This is what you'd see on most save files, as I assume a lot of people simply transfer their chapter 1 save to chapter 2.
But what do you see in a chapter 2 save that doesn't carry over chapter 1?
A completely clean chapter 2 file, while you can't get to name the vessel, and so because of that the vessel's name wouldn't show up on the file, the game does automatically pick out the prompts for the vessel that you'd normally pick if you did the Goner Maker.
Automatically, as in it automatically picks every option that would set the vessel flags to 0. Now that's interesting. That would basically set all of the flags to 0.
Maker. So if you let the game pick these choices by itself, it just picks the first option of every single prompt except for It's a Gift, where the game picks Mind. Which I would have said that this implies the vessel will have some relevance later, or that its gift carries a relevance of its own, and not to say that it won't because we really have no idea, but I've come to learn that this is because of some coding shenanigans that I think I need to explain real quick.
Okay.
Usually, when you're making a variable for the purpose of storing a choice that the player makes, your index, or rather your starting number, is 0. So, for instance, this prompt here in the Goner Maker, the first option would have a variable number of 0, then 1, then 2, and so on.
Yeah.
This specific prompt, however, that stores what gift you want for the vessel is saved as an index of 1, which means that what's really going on with the variables is that it goes from 1 to 0 to -1 and so on.
Why?
What do you know? Because all of the options that are picked on a fresh chapter 2 save are with the variable number of 0. The option that gets picked here is not the first one, but the second one, which is Mind. So really, it should be the first option, but because of how this prompt was coded, I'm not actually sure if it was intentionally meant to be the second option anymore.
So, weird coding bug or intentional? I think that it's a weird coding bug and nothing more. Surely not.
Toby, you're very cool and awesome, but the way you code things sometimes worries me. Just
Toby code.
a little bit. In fact, funnily enough,
Toby code is the best code. Toby code. Amazing. The same reason why a bit of Asgore sound gets played at the very end of Papyrus's speech. The reason why it does that is because Undertale is a 2015 role-playing game developed by American developer Toby Fox.
my other point about the Goner Maker now also has to be corrected, as it's another instance of the game's non-Euclidean coding. So first, let me just establish how this game's saving system works real quick, and Undertale's by extension. If you open up any of your save files, you'll see that what your game keeps track of are all of these numbers and the occasional strings and booleans and whatever, each one being in their own line, or rather flag, that the game looks at and registers as your data.
And each line corresponds to a different thing in the game. We've seen this with Undertale, and we've seen it with Zelda in Chapter 1. Each line corresponds to a different thing in the game. Even going as far as to store item IDs in separate lines. So
my original belief about the flags or variables that deal with the choices you pick in the Goner Maker was that all the flags were in the order that the prompts were presented in. As in, from flag 1217, the choice for which head you picked for the vessel, to flag 1226, which I thought was the pain and seizure question, I originally thought that these flags were arranged in such a way that you could go from top to bottom in the same order that the game presents these choices.
Okay.
This is wrong. And originally, I was going to assume that because flag 1224, which I assumed was for how you felt about the vessel, was always at 0, that it meant that this flag would always be set to 0 no matter what you picked, effectively nullifying it, since Gaster says that the vessel will not hear whatever response you pick. And that flags 1225 and 1226 were the last two questions, which are the pain and seizure one and the have you answered honestly question. What I've now learned is that flag 1226 is actually for the prompt that handles which gift you want for the vessel, and flag 1223 stores the choice for how you feel about the vessel.
Why?
As you can tell, I picked kindness, and this is the prompt which has an index of 1, so kindness would be the first option, setting this flag to 1. And flag 1223 is also set to 1, which would be hope, as that is the second option in that prompt. Where the pain and seizure and have you answered honestly flags actually are in flags 1224 and 1225.
Okay.
As you can see on this save file and the playthrough of the game I recorded, I picked yes for these two questions, setting these to 0, as most players probably would. But I tested this by starting a new save and instead picking no for these questions. And what do you know, these two flags are now set to 1 on the new save. So there's that. I feel kinda dumb that I didn't catch on to this sooner, but then again, these things happen when it comes to figuring out Undertale or Deltarune's code, and I imagine with Chapter 2's release, whatever new flags it added ended up shifting stuff around. But regardless, I just wanted to prevent any potential misinformation. Thanks to Half-Bred Chaos for letting me know about this. On with the analysis. And, in fact, I guess this is where I'm going to be yet again rambling about the save system in Deltarune because there's been some changes made to how it works in Chapter 2, and there's another thing about it that completely baffles me. So, let me start with the UI change made.
The saving system.
In Chapter 1, save points functioned identically to Undertale, pretty much. You hit a point, it shows you the one save file you're playing on, you save, and boom, you're done. It only ever shows you the one save slot that you picked from the menu, and you can't save to another slot from the current
Chapter 2 shows 3 saves.
Chapter 2 changes this, as now, whenever you interact with the save point, you are not only given more options, such as storage and recruits, but when you save, you can do so to any of the 3 save slots from pretty much any point.
True.
Even in this demo, Chapter 1's save system is unmodified, so it's definitely an intentional changement for Chapter 2 and onward specifically. And presentation-wise, I just find it kind of weird, but knowing that Toby wanted Chapter 1 to be people's expectations of the game being thrown out the window, I guess it makes sense.
Yeah.
But this is where Sham and the Shadow Crystals come in again for a moment. When you go to Castletown for the first time in this chapter, and if you've defeated Jevil and have a Shadow Crystal from a completed Chapter 1 save file, Sham will take note of it and take it off your hands, being surprised at the thought that Jevil even had one, which implies that they've known about them for a while, weirdly enough. They go on to say that they get the feeling you'll find more of them if you continue to fight the secret bosses of each chapter, and that if you can get your hands on more of them, then Sham can make something incredible for you. However, here's the weird part about this. Even if you have beaten Jevil on a different save file and started Chapter 2 completely clean, Sham still remembers your fight with Jevil. In fact, as long as you have been a secret boss at all, if you go left of Castletown and interact with this opening, you'll get the appropriate weapon or armor from the previous chapter's secret boss, as well as their Shadow Crystal. As far as I know, this is the only instance of a boss fight or encounter being permanent across save files, including ones where that shouldn't be the case, and Sham plays into this by asking a lot in their dialogue in this chapter. You defeated that clown last time, didn't you? Maybe you just hadn't remembered it yet? Are you sure that you haven't fought him? They ask these questions as if this is something the Fun Gang or even the player has already done before and we just don't remember it, yet Sham does. This isn't even taking into account the fact that Sham just somehow knows about Spamton and refers to him as that salesman, but I'll get there soon enough. Point is, not only do we now have proof of the game being able to change its contents depending on what slot you're playing on, but now there's ample opportunity for certain actions to be permanent no matter if you are playing on a completely clean save or a transferred one.
Snowgrave. What if the game permanently changes if you do Snowgrave in a certain chapter? Like, maybe, just maybe, Snowgrave in Chapter 5 would change the game.
There's one more thing I'd like to note as well, relating to stats actually.
Okay.
You'll notice that in Chapter 2, in the Dark World, the party is at level 2 thanks to sealing the fountain in Chapter 1. Internally, what I find very curious is that this is referred to as false LV, as your level in the Dark World is entirely separate from your LV in the Light World. In fact, love is displayed as its own stat in the configuration file compared to level, and your love does not go up in either chapter from LV1 no matter what route you do. So, with all of that taken into account, I guess I can finally move on from here and on to...
Oh no. Oh no.
It's at this point that I think it'd be appropriate to bring up another character in the game so far that I think knows way too much about the nature of
Ralsei!
otherwise. Ralsei. Because as far as I know, there is not a single other character, aside from Gaster technically, and this specific Rudin that ever utters the player's name. While it's made out to be sort of a random thing to shrug off, it's certainly really fucking weird that this is the only time it's ever mentioned, and there are no means we know of that would explain how anyone would know about our name to even begin with.
I hope this pops up in, like, Chapter 3 and later. Because it would be so fucking cool if another character, or Rose himself, just blurts out the player's name. Like, that would be insane if just blurts out the player's name.
The only clue we get is, or so I heard it's called, after the stated name of the town, implying they heard it from someone else. And how does this lead into Rouse, you might ask? Well, if it weren't for the worrying amount of accommodation for his knowledge that we are controlling Chris, I wouldn't be batting an eye at him, but there's a lot of instances of things that, while they could be explained by just simple player convenience and trying to get people used to playing the game, part of me can't help but think that his role of being the game's tutorial and hint guy maybe should have more attention called to it. There's already the fact that he does the tutorial for you, where he explains how to handle fights in the game down to what buttons to press and what UI elements to pay attention to. But there's other instances, like this one box puzzle in the field, where Rouse tells you, press the boxes onto the switches with Z.
Yeah.
The first you see is like, wait, Rouse, what the fuck are you talking about? Who is Z? Which you only get out of her once, by the way. After that, she just says that you could use your hands. Or why not this other instance in Chapter 2, where you're in the trash zone, and as you're about to leave, Rouse gives you a reminder about your storage and about sparing enemies to recruit them.
Rouse is a very interesting character.
Like, whoa, that sounds pretty important. But, and this might just be my interpretation, but I feel like this response gives an aura of, man, those sure were words you just said. Like, I don't know what that means, but sure, noted. And of course, there's the fact that Rouse knows the layout of the school, which isn't inherently weird because Queen seems to also be aware of the Dark World being confined in the lab, but he then tells Chris to go to the old classroom to the east of the closet doors as if Chris doesn't remember the layout of the school that they've been going to for who knows how many years. Which, again, this is just my interpretation. Maybe I'm asking a lot of Chris because they have enough on their plate as is, but these are very specific instructions to give to someone who has seen Hometown much more than the player has. And there's just a reminder from Rousey again when you're in Castletown after sealing the second fountain about saving, and I just want to call attention to this dialogue because I find it so fucking weird. He refers to Chris in this instance about saving and taking a break anytime you want.
Yes.
But this doesn't make any sense to Chris.
Yeah, bro, I live here. What are you on?
Concept is still a very new
what is bro yapping about? I literally live here. Why are you telling me this? I know where the classroom is. You don't have to tell me and baby and say, oh, you go to the east, and the old school go to the east of, you know, the thing. Go east, collect everything there, and come back here to the exact closet door. I know more about the school than you do, even though you've been there your entire fucking life, okay? Just listen to me.
To them as far as we know. Their save file from when you interact with the save point for the first time certainly suggests this, and Chris doesn't have the ability to just hop out of the Deltarune experience at any point. They exist within that world, and they've been doing so well before we came into the picture. The only character, so to speak, who would possibly need to save to take a break right now and would be familiar with this concept is the player. Again, there is a very fair chance that some of these interactions do serve a sole purpose of just trying to be convenient to the player, but with what kind of meta fuckery these games have been capable of in the past, are you really gonna tell me that Toby wouldn't make the idea of video game hints and reminders diegetic? Or rather that it would just be completely off the table no matter what? The way I see it, the seeds for it are already there. I think there's ample evidence to suggest that when Rouse says Chris most of the time on screen, he's really referring to you. And Susie's confusion at some of the things he says would definitely add fuel to this, as Susie only knows Chris. She doesn't know that you're controlling them. And I'm not ruling out the possibility that this could all be a giant joke and for the funny, but it's still dialogue that was added to the game. And knowing how this sort of thing goes, everything in Deltarune is either for a giant gag, is there to be poking at a massive plot and lore reveal, or is both somehow. And I haven't even mentioned the fact that Rouse in both chapters has been able to shift the perspective of the player away from Chris and has used that diversion to his advantage by talking to Chris off screen. Or the fact that after beating the optional boss of chapter 2 that requires going off the beaten path, Rouse does his best to shrug off what happened, because he most definitely knows things that he'd rather not discuss so early on in the journey. Or the fact that on a weird route you completely lose the chance to see the interaction between Susie and Noelle alone, and the Ferris wheel sequence doesn't even happen, which leaves Rouse genuinely confused and quick to ask Susie what happened, as if things have gone completely off script for him. I guess my point being, while characters like Jevil and Spampton definitely are more aware of the nature of Deltarune's world in a meta sense, there's just something about Rouse. Not only does he seem to be aware of how the game works on the player's end, but he's actively concerned about the player experience of the game and his control over what the player actually sees, at least on normal routes. And his manner of being very specific with his instructions in a way that would only make sense to the player and is pointed out to be very fucking weird to people around him doesn't feel like something that I can just ignore. And I think when you take into account how many features are actually added and tweaked between chapters, such as the recruit system, or the introduction to elements or storage, and Rouse giving reminders about how most of these systems work, I feel like it can't be completely baseless on my part why I feel this way about him in this regard. Of course, I can't say this is fully exclusive to Rouse because there's instances like the Masters in the Chapter 1 field, who do mention things like tension points and HP and battle mechanics in general in a similarly specific way, and that bit in Chapter 2 where an enemy has to explain to Noelle how the combat works, to which she does draw an interesting comparison to Dragon Blazers, and that is another rabbit hole of its own, but there's at least a consistency in that the battle system—
We'll get to the Spampton tweet fake stuff in like an hour. Well, in like a little over an hour. We'll get to sweepstakes in a little over an hour. We have a lot to go.
But I feel that does not explain why Rouse is so specific about what direction to go into Light World, or saving and all the different features that come with it, or pressing Z next to the box to move it. This is certainly more on the reaching end of my interpretations of the game, but it feels like a necessary thing to account for when the developer of the game has very much used mechanics like these as important plot points in the past. I could be dead wrong, but I'm just saying it's incredibly weird, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's something more to it.
There could be more to it.
But yeah, I'll get back to all the weird shit about Rouse later on when I get to talk more about my theory and put everything together in my own way, but there's still plenty of other things I need to cover about Chapter 2, so let's just continue with something a little simpler. Let's talk about the egg again. In Chapter 2, the egg makes another appearance, this time in the Cyber City. In fact, even the man that gives you the egg makes 2 appearances in this chapter, depending on if you got the egg from the last chapter. If you did, and if you interact with one of the cars in the traffic jam outside the library, you'll see a man waving at you. And moving on to Cyber City, in the room where you have 2 roads separated by some switches, if you stop the cars on both roads and manage to run to the bottom of the first road, you'll see the second road actually extends further down.
Yes.
And going down here before you get run over, you'll find yourself in an alleyway with the only knockable door in Cyber City, and also a Toby Fox jump scare.
Yeah.
Fake game over included. You then find yourself back in the alleyway with a dumpster, some moss, and graffiti of one of the trees from the Scarlet Forest. Interacting with it, you get flavor text hinting that you can do what you did last chapter and walk between this room and the other room to eventually load into the next secret area, with Chris alone again like last time. You go out of bounds beyond the blue road and you see another tree, which, going behind it, you meet the man once again, who may be happy to see you. You get the choice again to accept his offering of the egg, and if you do, you'll have the second egg of the game, which functions identically to how it did in Chapter 1.
Yep.
When you get to explore the Light World again, you'll find that interacting with the egg that Temmie has in class actually tells you how many eggs you've collected thus far, and going to Santa's shop, you can put the second egg into the basket of them, to which Susie just asks if you reverse stolen egg. Just make sure to interact with that first and not with anything else up here in the shop, because apparently interacting with other stuff here before the basket also triggers the flag of you placing the egg, and you'll miss out on the basket interaction. This definitely seems to be a bug, but as of now it still hasn't been patched, so there's that. But that's the extent to any egg-related activities in Chapter 2, and of course we still have no idea just what it's building up to. However, weirdly enough, you can't actually get this egg on a weird route. The method to doing so is completely locked off. So whatever the eggs could be building up to, it looks like you can't really see that for yourself if you're, freezing your chicken. Now we can talk about...
This next segment is going to be discussing Spampton, however, I'm putting a very strong flashing lights warning on the transition I do for this segment, just in case. Sorry about that. It has happened when talking about no one race sales in 1997s. Skip to this time simply for sensitive such things, so 42:37, so only like 10 seconds, maybe. Yeah. Or maybe now.
Now we can talk about...
Spamton!
What have I done?
If you thought Jevil and Sham or Rouse were full of metafuckery and constant fourth wall breaks that made you feel like your brain was about to explode from all the questions...
Then oh boy, you have not met Spamton, our favorite #1 salesman in 1997. Mike.
As they end up adding to the lore of the game, Spamton is like the elephant's foot for such things. Just a few minutes around this disgusting little man and you're gone before you even know it. I don't even know where to begin, honestly, but let's just start from when you first encounter him and work from there.
Yeah.
In Cyber City, when the car is stopped in the traffic jam and you have to go to the other side of the road to clear it, you're stopped in the middle of this alleyway and the only mandatory sequence involving Spamton in Chapter 2, assuming you're not doing the weird route. This has been pointed out before, but if there's anything to get out of Spamton immediately is that Spamton is on the other end of a spectrum of sorts where Jevil was on one end. With Jevil, you had to go out of your way to look for him, and when you did find him, he's more invitational in his mannerisms. Whereas Spamton makes himself known the first chance he gets, even if you don't fully go through with his deals, you do have to fight him at least once. And you see, another thing about Spamton that makes him so fucking hard to read sometimes is just his way of speaking. While Jevil at least can be understood in hindsight as he uses a lot of metaphors and imagery through his wording to convey what he's getting at, there are just some things Spamton says that are obfuscated or have a random thing thrown in to substitute whatever he's actually trying to say, so a lot of analyzing Spamton comes down to filling in the blanks that these bracket phrases end up making.
Yes.
So everything I am going to say about his dialogue is just the best assumption I could possibly make from looking at what he says and also after looking at many theory videos that have already done plenty of analysis on this character, from the thematic importance that he carries to his relation to other secret bosses to why he is Cat. So moving on. He makes himself known after coming out
Why
of
he is
his dumpster
Cat.
home and notices Chris, which is pretty big news to Spamton as he knows that Chris is a Lightner and therefore has a heart-shaped object, or a soul.
Yes.
And in one of many moments in this chapter where Chris does act more on their own, they seem genuinely kind of freaked out at the sight of this dude. Spamton, seeing himself and Chris at this moment, with them being alone and being rather spot on with the idea of them having lost control of their life, possibly alluding to the soul overriding the control that Chris has over themselves, poses a deal to them, and implies that he knows a way that him and Chris can change that fate, that being a certain hyperlink blocked and becoming big shots. And for this to happen, all Chris has to do is just show him their soul. And this is where the first fight with Spamton happens. We get a little glimpse of Spamton's past in this fight as he says that he used to already be a big shot, but that now he needs a bit of generosity. And the fight comes down to pretty much taking Spamton's deal and negotiating with him in various ways. Once you reach full mercy with him, the fight ends and he tells you to meet him back at the trash zone and to visit his shop alone.
Okay.
Which, if you do want to see his deal through, is where you go next. And alright, I want to just take a moment to talk about this room and specifically this door. Does nobody find this fucking strange? There's a great door in the middle of this room just sticking out from all the garbage, and when you enter it, you see a wall behind Spamton that has no business being there, and a phone to the right just sort of sitting there in the darkness, ringing at a specific point in the song that's playing. It's not really something that I can get much out of, and the weird glitchiness of this shop lines up a bit with the messed up tiles that you see throughout Cyber City, and especially in the trash zone, but it's just... I mean, look at this. What am I even supposed to say? Like, I remember when I first played this chapter over a year ago,
interesting.
The confusion that I felt when I saw this shop for the first time has not really changed one bit. As much as I try to make sense of the things going on in this game, I think with Spamton you just kinda have to go with it at this point. But the next important thing to touch on is his dialogue when you're talking with him in the shop. When you select Our Deal, he lays out the plan for what he wants you to do. Go into the basement in the Queen's mansion and find something in there, particularly an empty disc that will make both him and Chris big, using the keygen that you buy from him to get past the encryption. When you select About You, he goes more into his past of how he used to be the email guy before becoming big, and also actually alluding to Jevil how he used to be the email guy before becoming...
Though unintelligible laugh could also be taken as illusion as a smile, as it's a very slowed down version of Muppet's laugh. Okay.
And also actually alluding to Jevil as that damned clown around town as he wants to surpass him and reach for the big one. So not only is there an established history between him and Jevil, but in regards to what the big one might be referring to, it could be in reference to the Neo body or just a higher level of power closer to that of a Lightner, or perhaps something even more powerful? Again, just assumptions. But it's when you select Night that things get especially fucking weird. He actually alludes to knowing something about the knight before getting cut off and apologizing to something off-screen, which could be the knight or something that probably just stopped him from revealing things that he shouldn't, before uttering probably my favorite fucking line in this entire game so far. But you'll only get to select this option once, as after you do, it's replaced with the friends option. And selecting that, you get spammed into assuring Chris that they already are friends, that they don't need anything. No easels, no CRTs, no...
Mike.
Before cutting himself off and telling Chris to not believe anything they see on TV. Very likely foreshadowing for Chapter 3's main antagonist, but that's a whole other can of worms, although it does continue the trend that Jevil said in Chapter 1 of foreshadowing the next chapter's antagonist. Just much more directly this time around. And finally, selecting Fear, we get the most bizarre outcome. Spamton assures that there's nothing to be afraid of except...
Mike.
Well, he gets cut off as a voice suddenly starts crying for help, asking if anyone can hear them. Before Spamton comes to again and says that they didn't hear anything, but it sounded like they were talking to you. And while there's not much in the way of confirming this completely, this does line up very closely with the unused script from Chapter 1, and if these two things are to be connected, then it certainly makes me wonder how much more the supposedly unused script is going to bleed into the actual game. In fact, in the Japanese translation of this line, it apparently literally does just quote the Japanese translation of unused, so there's that, I suppose. Which, speaking of, this is one of only two things I really need to mention about the game internally in Chapter 2, but the unused script is updated in this chapter, now having a new set of text for each variable. This time it continues from Chapter 1's version of the script, as the voice assumes that nobody can really hear them. In fact, they're not really sure if they can hear themselves because of how dark and quiet it is, yet they swear that sometimes they can hear what they best describe as...
What?
Some sort of scratching.
Huh.
But that's all we can get from this version of the script, and as of now, that is the extent to what we know about the character that is speaking all of this dialogue in this function.
Maybe we'll get an unused script in Chapter 3 that will continue the dialogue from Chapter 2. We can only hope, because who is this mysterious person in the unused code, and will they ever be introduced in the actual game? I think so.
It's still really anyone's guess what's going on with this unknown character or what that scratching noise could even be. But for the moment, that's where the unused script ends, so let's just continue on.
Okay.
You eventually get to Queen's mansion and to the room with the encryption. You use the keygen to unlock it, and just like the Spampton shop, Chris, on their own accord, tells the others to stay behind and like Prisco on their own to the basement. And I still can't get over just how fucking bizarre this area is, even after my first and second playthrough of this chapter.
It's wild.
It's such a tonal whiplash. Completely empty.
Hang on. They're gonna smell something here. Hang on. I gotta check on something here. So to make this reaction not too long, I will cut this part, and then we'll come back. I need to let my dogs out, so I will cut this part, and then we can go back for the next part. So, actually, no, wait, no, never mind. I'll just leave this up here. I really need to find a way to pause the recording here. I don't know. I'll be in like a few minutes. You can skip ahead if you want. I don't blame you, but yeah. Skip ahead to when I come back. And welcome back to the recording. I know that you probably skipped ahead, so hi!
The
Let's get
hall
back
has
into
several
it.
rooms with mostly empty chests, these weird things that jump at you and also scare you if you're idle for long enough, which is weird enough on its own already, and whatever the fuck this is. So, if you go in this room where the teacup ride for the basement is, if you run to the end of the room, then to the other end, and back before the ride makes its way up, you'll see this face appear for a brief moment. This was the sole exception to my theory that every all-caps thing in the files was related to just stuff in the menus, as internally, the sprite of the smile is called image friend, and the corresponding object is device friend. Its only function as an object is to appear, gradually lessen in opacity, and then disappear, and there's nothing else regarding its function in the code. Aside from every other file that uses all caps, this is the only one that you can actually encounter in the playable game beyond Goner Maker or the menus. So, what or who the hell is this?
Yeah, what?
With the context of just Chapter 2, we have absolutely no fucking clue. It could be Spampton, it's probably not, but it
Could be Mike.
It could be the supposed Mike character that Spampton was alluding to. It could be whatever the next secret boss is, if it's not Mike, or maybe it's even just Gaster himself, who fucking knows? But if looking at it solely from a meta perspective, maybe this makes more sense to fit in this group of all caps files than it might initially seem? When you think about it, this object is still out of bounds, it's unreachable, and its only purpose realistically is to just fuck with the
still
player
is
and
out of
catch them off
bounds.
guard. How naming it friend probably plays into that. While it could be referencing that this is someone that Spampton or some other character knows, there's no way it's not named that for the purpose of just freaking people out more, referring to this as a friend in a very ominous way. I do have some other ideas as well for how this fits into the whole meta side of things, but I think I'll save that for just a bit later.
Okay.
But that is actually all the all caps files that I could find in the game, though we still have quite a bit to go over in Chapter 2, so let's keep going. You shut down the force field, go through this nightmare which I managed to survive first try in this playthrough because I am so good at video games, and after going through a very ominous railroad, you find yourself in a room with many empty openings, save for the very last one which bears some resemblance to Mettaton Neo's body, and this is where you get the empty disc. You can also talk to Swatch after getting the disc to ask about the basement, to which he just fucking gaslights you. But you go back to Spampton's shop with the disc, which is where he gives you the next step in his plan. Give the disc to him so that he can transfer his hyperlink blocked, which in this case, and for a good portion of mentions of hyperlink blocked, I want to say refers to control or something related to it that would be spoiling something if said hyperlink was not blocked.
Okay.
Once you go through with the transfer, he then wants you to go back to the basement and put the disc back where you found it. He does warn you, however, that doing the transfer will close his shop permanently, which makes sense since if you do the transfer then...
Yeah. This.
Oh. The screen always freaked me out. It's so subtle, but
Yeah, this screen is always one that kind of unnerves me a little bit, because it happens so subtly, and then all of a sudden it's just... nothing. Just completely grayscale with a slower version of dial tone playing, so...
This only happens immediately after transferring, but you can still go back to the shop after this, and it's just empty. Like, there's no reason why I should be able to come back to see this screen again, yet it feels like this reminder of what you did, in a way.
Yeah.
That, and it does line up a little bit more visually with the gray doors, so perhaps this is how this place looked like before Spampton set up shop here? I'm not really sure, but it did stick out to me a lot, especially on a first playthrough. Moving on, you do as Spampton says, and you put the disc back in the Neo body in the basement, and...
nothing happens. Or so
nothing
you
happens.
think.
That is, until you go about halfway back through the room with the tracks.
Holy Congadero! I feel great!
He's happy with this newfound power, yet he still notices these strings holding him back, realizing this body still isn't strong enough to make him truly free. And this is when he turns to Chris to try
It's
to...
still dark. So dark. Gaster reference?
their soul from them in an attempt to get even more power, to which, while Chris seems a bit disoriented, they don't make an effort to really stop him or go into any defensive stance, weirdly enough.
Spamton is stopped by Rousey and Susie, and then cue the Spamton Neophyte, where we get the first instance in Deltarune of the soul's color changing, in this case to yellow, being a parallel to Mettaton's fights in Undertale. Generally, I can't get too much about the fight other than some particular bits of dialogue that do stick out. There's at least another potential allusion to the next main antagonist with the mention of Cathode's screams, Mike is mentioned again, Spamton directly mentions heaven.
Yeah.
He makes a lot of effort to try to get Chris to hand their soul over politely, but particularly asking if they want to be a heart on a chain their whole life rather than what is, at least in Spamton's eyes, becoming bigger and closer to freedom.
Okay.
Now, whether you attack him or spare him, the outcome after the fight stays the same, but the things that happen at the end of the fight do change. When you attack him, he scolds you for thinking that depleting his HP will do the trick and tries to transform into Spamton X before just fucking going kaboom. But the much more unsettling option comes from sparing him.
Oh yeah, the
If you
spare.
decide to cut all of his strings down to the very last one keeping him up, he takes it as you actually trying to gift him his freedom despite the threat of killing them just earlier. He finally realizes that success comes from not just determination, but the power of friendship, and gets ready for his last—
Very, very interesting tidbit regarding this track that plays during this scene of Real Boy. Toby, whether intentionally or not, decided to sample Canon in D for this song. I don't know why he did, but the reference is there. I mean, it definitely is there.
last string to be cut before—
Dead. Boom.
The
Well
game
then.
then cuts back to a much more resigned Spamton, realizing he really has done everything he could, even if it didn't work out, and figures that if he's done his part, then he can at least be of use to the Fun Gang, and you get whatever item you get from him depending on how you did the fight, and his Shadow Crystal. This Shadow Crystal, when used in the cyber world, shows a brief glimpse of the computer lab, similar to how the first one briefly showed the unused classroom.
Okay.
And in the light world, as a shard of glass, using it shows a glimpse of Susie glaring coldly at Chris through the glass, when in reality she's smiling and just flipping them off or something. Shortly after, though, when the Fun Gang is about to leave the basement for good, Susie stops and she has a moment of just genuinely wondering what the fuck just happened. Rousey tries to shrug it off as just corrupted data that shouldn't be given too much thought, and Susie notices Chris's expression and asks if you're doing alright. And this is one of the most standout examples of the potential dissonance between Chris and the player, as you can say yes, but Susie will feel like Chris doesn't really mean it if you pick this option, with Rousey simply passing it off as Chris not wanting the group to worry about them. But picking no will have Chris yell, which would be a first thus far in the game for them, and Rousey tries to comfort them to get their mind off of it. It goes without saying, there is a lot of discussion about what people think Chris really feels in regards to Spamton. Even by Chapter 2's standards, I can't say Chris really acts on their own as much as they do in any scenes that involve Spamton, and it can be boiled down to a lot of things. We know Chris has a tendency to obey random requests, like there's this interaction with Brady in Chapter 1 where she recounts on how Chris just got her, Asriel, and other friends of theirs a bunch of food just because they were asked to, so it could be just common courtesy, despite them also having a tendency to be a bit of a silly trickster from time to time. But there's also the interpretation—
Wait a
of
minute.
a tendency to be a bit of a silly trickster from
That's Theft! Theft 9 mention! Hell yeah.
the time. But there's also the interpretation that Chris really did see Spamton as a friend, or at least saw a lot of themselves in him, like he saw a lot of himself in Chris, which would line up especially well with the outcome for sparing him, as there's definitely a sort of parallel to draw between the strings that were holding Spamton back and the whole situation with us being the metaphorical strings holding Chris back. A sort of reminder that even if they were to cut those strings for good, that it wouldn't be sustainable for them. Especially when you consider the weight that the soul is given with it having the fate of the world and what have you. I'd say there also might be a third interpretation, and that's— I don't know, maybe Chris is actually just kind of scared of Spamton in general? Like, they don't look comfortable around him. They often walk back a few steps, they don't bother to defend themselves when their soul is about to get taken from them, which would be a sign of them being okay with the idea of it, or them just being genuinely in terror. And even in Spamton's shop, the option for leaving is just called escape. It might lead into them being afraid of becoming Spamton as well, that they don't want to become that desperate, and that they do see themselves in him, but not in a good way, or one that would really warrant them seeing him as a friend, but more like a cautionary tale.
There's a lot of ways to look at it, and this dynamic between Spamton and Chris is one of the reasons why there's just so much fucking depth to Spamton as a character, as he by far has some of the strongest impact we've seen on Chris, and I think it's definitely worth mentioning because if a secret boss can leave that kind of impact on our main character here, and knowing the kind of information that secret bosses appear to have access to, it does seem relevant to understanding the game from a meta perspective as well. But I can't say for sure. Either way, God, that's finally everything about Spamton, at least for when he is actively present in Chapter 2. Safer weird route, but I'll get there.
Yeah, get there when you get there.
Mentions anything that's very meta, like how Jevil casually referred to HP before his fight, I do think there's definitely a lot of stuff that does show he knows more than most other characters do about Deltarin's nature. Okay. He knows of Jevil, he's directly hinted at the next main antagonist, and at this Mike character that we don't know much about other than Mike being a former close associate of Spamton's. He's had a different character likely speak through him, and this is most commonly believed to be the character from the Unused Strings, and his goal pretty much was to reach a level of power that ultimately would have required the soul, or our control, in order to achieve that. While not so direct, I think the idea of a character trying to literally be you and reach your level of control is pretty fucking significant, and with the motif of control going very much without saying at this point, it does still continue the trend of these secret bosses knowing a little more about how things really work compared to other characters. I guess there's also something to be said about the fact that he's a secret boss that also is a shopkeeper, given that Undertale has placed emphasis on a character like Gerson being immune to the player by sheer virtue of being a shopkeeper, and again, the whatever this is that happens when you have Spamton transferred to the disc. Maybe there's something of note about that. But really, it's a lot easier to look into his dialogue in the context of lore and in relation to characters like Chris, Noel, or Des, while Jevil was a bit more blatant about his understanding that he was in a game, and that knowledge making him feel like the only free one. Although, the thing with Jevil is that he's alluded to the theme of your choices not mattering. Like, if you refuse to do something with him, he says, how could you refuse a game that you're already playing, and stuff of that sort. He gives off the impression that while he knows he's in a fabricated reality, he can indulge in that and let himself be free, just enjoying whatever weird, fucked up ride the world has in store for them. Spamton, obviously, is not like this. His whole thing was just to gain more and more power to reach beyond heaven and reach a level of control alike to, or even exceeding ours. If absolutely anything, I think the closest I can get to finding an equivalent for him breaking the fourth wall outright like Jevil did with mentioning HP is actually in the fact that he's so blatantly aware of the soul and what it's capable of. There isn't another boss in the game that really focuses on it quite like Spamton does, and on top of that, the way he manipulates the presentation of the battle system also really adds on to that. There's also the fact that the soul color changes, which I think on a meta level is pretty significant, because it does make me ask a lot of questions. For one thing, why only now? Why only in this fight, and why does this never happen anywhere else in the game?
Quick break, I'm gonna go pee. I will be right back. Oh boy. If this goes on any longer, I may have to split this reaction up into 2 parts, which I really don't want to do, but, I mean, I might have to.
What conditions have
We'll
to
see
be
where
met
we
in order
are.
for the color of the soul to change? I've seen some theories about this that I was initially willing to believe, but I feel like more often than not they depend way too much on Undertale rather than thinking about Deltarune by itself. Not that Undertale has no weight in any of this, but consider. Every time the soul color changed in Undertale, it was often because of the boss you were fighting. When it turned blue, that was Papyrus's attack. When it turned green, that was Undyne's doing. When it turned purple, that was Muffet's doing. The only sort of exception is when it turns yellow, since that was thanks to Alphys' help, but regardless, the soul color never changes on its own. It's always thanks to someone else, either for your benefit or to limit you in some way. And the theory I often hear in Deltarune's case is that because Spamton was using Mettaton Neo's body, that the soul remembered something about it and that made it turn yellow by itself. But the thing is, if the soul is supposed to be the player, then I don't remember getting the input for it to turn yellow. It just did that on its own. I couldn't control that. So it leads me to maybe 2 guesses. The first one that I feel less inclined to believe, but still could be possible maybe, is that it relates to Chris and their understanding of souls.
Okay.
While we don't know too much about Chris, what I can say for certain is that they definitely do have a pretty decent grasp on how to keep us out of their business if they feel the need to. They have a very convenient bird cage for that, and while I don't know why that cage would have been there well before the player came into the picture, it does tell me that they have had some awareness of the mechanics of souls in Deltarune's world well before our perceived beginning of the story. So perhaps, somewhere in all of that research that Chris has done on them, there is something that relates to the color of the soul being able to change in certain situations. But, as you can tell, that required me to do a bit more reaching. So, the other interpretation that I felt more confident in honestly ended up being pretty simple. 2 words.
Divine intervention.
Divine intervention. And I know this is gonna sound kind of ridiculous, but hear me out. Spamton is one of a few characters in the game who has a pretty strong connection to Gaster. We also literally have a connection to Gaster that was made at the beginning of the game, and he is overseeing our behaviors both in-game and even in the menus. He gives us the prompt to either continue or give up whenever we get a game over, so clearly whenever we lose any battle or our HP in general, he is the one that has to handle that situation when it pops up. Now, to not get too ahead of myself, as I haven't summarized Spamton's backstory yet, we do know that he has likely been in communication with Gaster, but that communication was ceased at some point. And to not go too deep into Theory Chaos yet, all that I know I can say with complete certainty is that Gaster, as a rather powerful force in this game, plays a big role in why we even exist or can persist in Deltarune's world through the soul, which is integral to the game's battle system. And we know that Spamton's whole thing is that he does what he does because he's trying to become big again and to meet or even exceed the power of a Lightner, ultimately through the acquisition of our soul.
We have another hour and a half left of this video? My god. Well, we've already spent an hour and a half going through the first hour.
So, what would a being with powers and a presence that is eldritch in nature do when he sees that one of his former associates is trying to break the order of things and could pose a threat to the player and by extension, the fate of the world? You stop everything for a moment and give the player an advantage and get them acquainted with it before letting them continue on. Yes, I know that basically saying that the soul changing partially because of Gaster sounds incredibly contrived, and honestly I am ready for this theory to be completely steamrolled over. I try to be very careful with my references to him and what he might be involved in, because really you could say Gaster is involved with anything and it might have the slightest basis to it because of how little we know about him. So I'm not going to say that this is a very strong or even remotely foolproof interpretation, but it feels simple and relevant enough to the circumstances of this specific fight that, unless we get any proper explanation for the soul-changing colors that is more detached from him, I can't really think of a better one at the moment. But I don't want to ignore this detail either, because given the emphasis placed on us being this soul, I think it's definitely important enough to give some time to. The only other possible lead we have about the soul color changing is that it only changed to yellow once Spamton started using specifically blue attacks, which before that point and after that point have never appeared in any other fight. This could at least imply that maybe the soul was able to change on instinct upon seeing an obstacle that its normal mode wouldn't be able to overcome, so perhaps it is simply able to adapt to situations like that on the fly, but only when it deems itself necessary to, and that's why it never shows up in any other fight. But similarly, it could just be that if my divine intervention theory is somehow true, that Gaster saw Spamton using those attacks, knew that it would be possible to overcome normally, and decided to give the player the yellow soul advantage in response. I think it could go either way really, because we just barely know anything about how souls work in Deltarune specifically, or what conditions have to be met for the soul to change colors.
But that's all I can really say on that for now. Either way, this finally leads into what you're able to learn about Spamton after his fight from Swatch and from the Addisons.
Yes.
Going back to Swatch, he gives some insight on the basement robot if you pick the appropriate option, stating that it was the embodiment of a Lightner's dream. Using Dark World logic, we can probably assume Swatch was basically a personified MS Paint, so we essentially learned that the robot was in fact a drawing of Metaton's ideal body that never really went anywhere, and it was left in the basement. Spamton learned about this, and knowing that it was made from a Lightner, tried to use it to fulfill his own goals. But it's when you return to the trash zone that you finally learn Spamton's backstory proper. He was a former Addison selling his own products much like the others, but for some reason they never really hit or went anywhere. Despite this, he showed great charisma, being sure that some way or another he'll make it big, and that is exactly what he did after enough desperation and making the right phone call. Or perhaps being called by the right person. Either way, he'd end up on the phone all the time, and that's when his products finally started to skyrocket. As a consequence, however, the Addisons felt that they were no longer needed and so stopped communicating with him. And eventually, that success would run out, even after moving into the Queen's mansion. Suddenly, the thing that was helping him just disappeared. He'd start praying to that robot he found in the basement, trying everything he could to bring back that thing that made him successful, to no avail. And eventually, he was evicted and stripped of any renown that he might have had before. However, when one of the Addisons went to check on him on the day of his eviction, he wasn't there, save for a phone left hanging from what must have been the middle of a conversation. The Addison could still hear something on the other end, but when he put the receiver to his ear, he heard nothing but garbage noise.
Same garbage noise
as I mentioned much earlier in the series, is specifically what the flavor text describes the smile.ogg soundbite as in Chapter 2, when you use the cell phone in the Dark World. So, we have a common thread now. Both Spamton and Jevil have most likely come into contact with Gaster at some point. In Jevil's case, he ended up learning about the true nature of the world as a game, and in Spamton's case, he must have learned something similar, or at least was taught on how to exploit that to his benefit. But that exploit only worked for so long. And in the face of him being stuck in a world where he doesn't get a say in things, he didn't try to just go along with it like Jevil did, but he did everything he could to try to spite it. And for the normal route at least, that is everything I can really say about Spamton. He is yet another character made victim to knowledge beyond what he could handle, and we can say with decent certainty at the moment that Gaster played a part in that like he did with Jevil. We still can't really parse why though, or what he exactly did or said to either of them that would leave them in the state that they ended up being in, but it was enough to completely shift her perspective
Skip to 10839
in some way or another.
Oh boy. And
with that, the next thing I can talk about is what happens when you give the second Shadow Crystal to Sham, as I do find it worth noting. First off, they imply that they do actually know about Spamton, or at least are familiar with him, as they refer to him as that salesman, which would make sense, as we know at least that Jevil and Spamton know each other, so maybe Sham just knows of him by proxy. They make their own comment as well about the old machine being Metaton's work, and then when talking to them after they take the second crystal, they tell you that the next secret boss might be impossible to win against without the Shadow Mantle, which Sham should have, but they seem to have had it taken from them. And they imply that if it stays that way, then at 2 Shadow Crystals they'll remain, which is worrying, but I'll give my thoughts on this later. That is pretty much everything to do with Shadow Crystals though, in Deltarune. There's only a few of them so far, and the common thread seems to be that in the Dark World they show a glimpse of where they would be in the Light World, while in there, as a glass shard, it shows an altered version of the Light World, and in both cases a rather grim alteration.
Okay.
And that would be everything in Chapter 2. That totally would be. But I've been holding off a very specific part of this chapter that I'm going to finally delve into now. Deltarune's whole thing at the very beginning was that your choices did not matter. It did not matter in Chapter 1 how you handled certain dialogue, what kind of vessel you made, what you did in the Light World, whether you fought Jevil. The game would end the same way ultimately, and the very most that would change is just the attitude of some of the people in the Dark World, but nothing outright horrible, just either, oh, we're niceys now, or, oh, you're actually mean, get the fuck out of here. For a while, we were to assume that this would be the same case for Chapter 2.
However, no, it's not the same case.
In the not short but not horribly long time frame where you only have Noelle with Chris, there is a way to actually kill enemies in the cyber world using her Ice Shock attack. Thanks to her lack of knowledge about how Dark Worlds work, or how the combat in general works, and through picking a few particularly manipulative dialogue choices that lead to her following what you say, under the impression that Chris just wants her to get stronger, your journey through the cyber world can very quickly turn into a bleak one with much more concerning consequences and implications in even the light world. Culminating in Noelle killing Birdley, using the attack that gives this alternate route its most common name,
Snowgrave.
Snowgrave route. For this video,
Which is actually a fan-made name. However, the actual name of the route that the game says internally is the weird route. So you have the internal name, which is the weird route, but you also have this fan-made name called Snowgrave route, which is named after, of course, the attack that kills Birdley. So, and the name's kind of a spoiler if you think about it, you know? It's just a little bit of a spoiler, but
video, I would be referring to it as the weird route, as I assume that this won't be the only chapter where this kind of thing can happen, and I believe that this is what the game refers to this route as internally. Either that or side B, although the mention of side B only appears in one object in the game to my knowledge, where weird route seems to pop up a little more frequently. There is absolutely no way I can make this video without talking about the weird route, because in
also, I wonder if Molly's gonna go over this, but apparently, when you're in Snowgrave or Weird Route or whatever, there was always an object off screen that controls if you're on Snowgrave. This object is the frozen Birdley. I believe that's correct from me watching Shay, a streamer who does a lot of Undertale and Deltarune and speedruns. I believe they were the one that showed off that this was the case, when there was a frozen Birdley in every single room, which was tied to Snowgrave in some way. I wonder if Molly's going to talk about that, but yeah, kind of an interesting thing. It goes along the lines of the fourth wall breaking thing and stuff that's happening out of bounds, you know.
Meta context, this is pretty much a giant sequence break. It doesn't feel like it should be possible, but it is. What is otherwise a playthrough of the chapter that lasts from at least 5...
For reference, my own playthrough of Chapter 2 lasted through roughly 7-8 hours between all of his recordings.
To up to 7, maybe even 9 hours, is now down to just over 2 or 3 hours. Major sections are skipped or otherwise cut down, lore dumps are glossed over, character development happens off screen, and a major character to the chapters straight up fucking dies. So
yeah.
There's quite a bit that's cut out of the picture. I still...
And the implications for that are fucking terrifying! Because if this kind of thing is also in Chapter 3, then do those things carry over into Chapter 3? Because if so, Birdley's fucking dead in Chapter 3. You know?
I remember first hearing about this route when Chapter 2 came out, and people genuinely did not believe it existed just from reading a summary of it, and yet, it was real. And I can't help but feel like that was kind of the intention. And actually, before I continue on, it's kind of hit me as I've been doing nothing but talking about Deltarune and meta shit and spammed in for who knows how long now. This part especially has been kind of a lot at once, and I feel like the pacing has been a little wild.
It has.
Hopefully not bad or too fast or anything, but there's just been a lot to cover, and I feel inclined to keep rushing through it. But we're effectively halfway through the series as a whole at this point. So how about we take it a little slower for a bit?
Okay.
I think this is what they call an intermission, except not really. I just need an excuse to indulge for a few minutes and illustrate what I think is one of Deltarune's most important themes.
Alright.
And it's not quite just escapism.
The intermission. And this, as much as I hate to do this, we've been at this for quite a while. Also, I don't feel like this should be too long, you know. The next part will be a little less, you know, taxing. But You know what? No. Continue on.
When I was editing Half-Bread's part of the Delta Cast months ago, there was this part that stuck out to me where there's an association made between Noelle and glitch hunting and, you know, just the idea of creepy video game stuff in general. And I think it's honestly a good way to embody just what I think the weird route is before I get to really talking about it. So, how about I let him cook for a bit just cuz before I give my own perspective on this side of things and on the route in general going forward.
Is that Shay? Is that Shay right there?
About Noelle is that she used to run a video game glitches and like rumors blog essentially.
Yep.
And so she was doing that for her entire childhood. And then when you take her to the Spamton door in the Snowgrave route, which opens essentially like you're finding a glitch, you have to do this really counterintuitive series of steps. She calls that door nostalgic, which someone in my chat pointed out could be a reference to her feeling nostalgic for her days glitch hunting in these sort of creepy video games.
Maybe.
So like Noelle is very strongly associated with like creepypastas, video game glitches, that whole culture at this point.
The glitch hunting thing is tied back to Gaster too.
True. Which is because that's how you find Gaster in the first place.
What with the fun values?
It's extremely meta because essentially what we have here is we have all these ideas of glitch hunting and video game creepypasta culture being brought up in a video game.
I find it kind of fascinating how much the Deltarune fandom especially exploded after Chapter 2's release, and how it wasn't just during the wake of Spamton, but of the weird route itself. One of the main things I think people felt kind of unsure about in regards to Deltarune was Toby's, still even now, continued insistence on the game only having one ending. And yet, despite having never been advertised publicly in the game, having never been acknowledged by Toby to this day, and having almost no hint to this route in the playable game aside from, I don't know, maybe one thing that Lancer said if you bothered to check your inventory when Noelle joined the party, the weird route is still one of the most often discussed topics of the game. Maybe not to casual players, but my point stands, and I really need to double down on this statement. The weird route was never advertised by Toby. There is no mention or allusion to the weird route in any of the...
I mean, yeah, you could construe that the only one ending question mark thing could be hinting at another route, but yeah. I suppose, but so vague that in conjunction with Toby being otherwise certain that the game only has one ending, it'd be easy to not paint too much attention until you've seen the weird route yourself. Yeah, I mean, Toby has always hammered home that there is one ending to this game, and that your choices do not matter. And Molly's right. He has never explicitly referenced or advertised that there was this whole other route in the game. He has never mentioned it, and never ever said anything about it or referenced it anywhere in any of the newsletters or blog posts or anything like that. He's always said one ending. There is one ending. Your choices do not matter. There is one ending. You don't need to go looking for anything else. There is one ending. Don't look for anything else. Please do not go out of your way to do something that you might regret soon. Yeah.
The store pages for the game. Secret bosses have been advertised, yes, maybe the eggs were never directly advertised and are more out of the way, but they feel just embedded enough in the game in a natural way that doesn't make you really question how it's even a thing. It's simply an Easter egg. But when I think about the weird route, I think about what Toby said way back when people were data mining Undertale, and the sentiment he must have had in the ballpark of feeling like games can never have secrets simply hiding in them anymore. It's always dug up from the files now, without full context, without the reward of learning about these secrets by word of mouth, not being sure how to get to them, but knowing a guy who knew a guy who vaguely remembers how to do it, and has a fuzzy memory of it, but was sure that it existed and was attainable if they just looked hard enough. The art of video game and generally playground and internet rumors in some ways is kind of dead now because information has become so much easier to access. Inherently, thanks to the modern internet, but in the past years tenfold thanks to the landscape of theorizing and game analysis specifically coming down to, here's what we found in the files, and if it's not in the files, then it doesn't exist, so it can't ever be true. However, this finality of existence or non-existence wasn't really always a thing, was it? There was a point in time where it was easier to tell stories of what might be, of what could be. The Bigfoot in San Andreas, the Mew under the truck, or maybe the Missing Nose, instantly getting the ray gun in Black Ops Zombies, the tall faceless man in the suit. and perhaps even the spirit inhabiting an uncanny Link statue in an old Zelda game, or the kind of weird-looking Tails doll in that one Sonic racing game everyone kept bashing back in the day when most of the YouTubers I used to watch didn't yet share political opinions that aged like fucking milk. Point is, whether you simply call them rumors, or creepypastas, or just glitches, the weird ride harkens back to this time a lot for me. The effort made to have people assume initially that the game was going to have only one ending, only to leave this in, knowing for sure people were going to find it on their own and spread the word on their own, is about the closest I have gotten to that feeling in a while. A long one at that.
Yes. And this is, unfortunately, where I have to end it now. We are about halfway through the video, which is kind of good, you know. Not too shabby for being halfway through the video, but I will have to cut it here for now. I don't want this to be too long, and also sitting here is yeah, need to get up, move around, do stuff like that. But yeah, I will see all of you in part B of the Deltarune device reaction. Later.